Can you give us a bit of insight into this?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to focus kind of on two aspects of it. I think we have to look at, and I do think actually the Human Rights Council and really the organization I'd like to speak about, which is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, have actually played probably the leading role in promoting what we term lawfare or delegitimization of Israel within the UN system in many ways. And particularly also Daniel had spoken earlier about the four arenas of conflict, two of them being public opinion and economics. And really this is the central area where the Human Rights Council has played a role. So I just want to give a little bit of background. People may know, but I think it's important just to refresh our memories of this background. So the Human Rights Council was founded in 2006. It was the successor entity to the Commission on Human Rights, which was disbanded in 2005 for overt politicization, which actually was its extreme bias towards Israel. And the body that actually supports the activities and executes the activities of the Human Rights Council is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and that was established in 1993. And the Human Rights Council, it's important to note, is a subsidiary body of the UN General Assembly. So really it can ultimately take orders from the General Assembly. I think it's also important just to talk quickly about the systemic bias against Israel within the Human Rights Council before getting at some of the more specific issues we've been discussing today. So when Daniel and Josh spoke about the Durban conference, it was actually the Office of the High Commissioner that organized that conference, ran the logistics for that conference. Within the Human Rights Council itself, most of you have probably heard of Agenda Item 7. There are 10 items on the permanent agenda of the Human Rights Council. The council meets 3 times a year, March, June, and September. And it is the only agenda item that deals with that singles out one country. So there's basically what we call an Israel bashing session each time the council meets. And all the other countries, if you want to discuss human rights issues affecting any other country, you do that under item 4. So it's quite notable that you have this agenda item 7. A very disturbing trend that we've been seeing at the Human Rights Council, and I don't want to get too much into the specifics, though I can during the Q&A, but basically several years ago, the European Union and European governments, for the most part, agreed to boycott the agenda item 7 meetings. And because of that, the Palestinians have been very effective in getting now, and the process is somewhat unknown. And again, we're not quite sure the role of the Office of the High Commissioner in this, but many of the resolutions and reports that would fall under item 7 on Israel have now been merged to item 2. So now at every session of the council, not only do we have Israel bashing day on item 7, we also have half a day of Israel bashing during item 2. So that's a very disturbing development. Another feature of what I would consider systemic bias at the council is the special rapporteur position. So again, Josh spoke a little bit about the activities of 2 very infamous, I would say, rapporteurs, John Dugard and Richard Falk. The rapporteur position for the Palestinians alone is the only position that never expires. It does not have to be renewed each year like all the other positions do. And typically the person who has been serving in that role has really been doing it to promote his own it's been all men, personal political agendas. And so Dugard and Falk have both used those positions to promote the apartheid canard. Dugard was probably the singular force in getting the ICJ opinion against the wall. The settlements database, aka BDS blacklist that the council put out in February 2020 was the brainchild of Richard Falk. So you can, and I'll speak a little bit about those implications. So this is the power that this position has, and it's always populated by basically an anti-Israel demagogue. The other important thing to note about basically what the Human Rights Council does is it passes resolutions on Israel. And then typically those resolutions call for the creation of reports. And who writes these reports? But the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So each year there are approximately 10 reports that is put out by this office. Sometimes it can be more because they also do a lot of the report writing for the Secretary General and the General Assembly on their reporting on Israel. And it's a very small office in Geneva. I've met with them many times. They don't have because it's a small office, it's only, it's less than 5 people. They do not have the capacity to do investigations or independently verify claims. So how they put their reporting together is they confer with UN agencies, and they also seek information from NGOs. And typically it's almost entirely from NGOs on one side of the political spectrum, and even very radical NGOs, not even the more mainstream NGOs. They typically go to the very radical side. And just to give you a brief anecdote, an example of that, in September, the OHCHR did a report on Israel's violation of water rights of Palestinians and presented it to the council in September. And they did not rely on any Israeli information in this report. Now, Israel and the OHCHR have a very fraught relationship. Right now, they're not speaking to each other. So I don't think it would have probably been very effective had the office approached the Israeli government for information. However, much of it is available online and public sourcing. So they could have gotten it if they wanted it. And they basically recycled claims, many false, from NGOs. So we've actually been doing some extensive writing on the water issue over the past 5 years or so. And we gave them a report that we were putting together that we also issued in September, updating our information on the water issue and to refute many of these NGO claims. And basically the office wrote back to me that they could not include our reports or any of our information because we had submitted it too late. And it was submitted to them more than a month before the report was written. They clearly had time, they could have put our claims in, but that's very common. And so what you'll see is, I call it kind of false claim washing, some sort of terminology like that, where they take these unverified NGO claims. It goes sometimes via a UN agency or directly to the Office of the High Commissioner, and then gets in the UN report, gets the stamp of the UN, and then suddenly that is the facts. And then you see those reports repeated everywhere when you look in campus, BDS resolutions, when you see Ben and Jerry's when they did their recent instituted their recent boycotts, they relied on these reports, and so that's how the process works, and that's how these claims get credibility when they shouldn't otherwise. Another area where the Office of the High Commissioner has been extremely influential has been on commissions of inquiry against Israel. So there have been 9, I believe, commissions of inquiry on Israel since the council has been founded in 2006. There were many also prior to that. That's the most by at least a factor of 4, maybe at least a factor of 4 than on any other situation. So even this past May, when we had the conflict, they instituted a new commission of inquiry against Israel. And this one, I think, really upped the ante compared to what we've seen in the past. Number one, it's permanent. It's a permanent commission. Previously, it was a one-off kind of thing. You'd have a commission, they would meet, present their reports to the council, and that would be it. This commission is now permanent. The money that's being spent on it right now in the budget, they're discussing the UN budget at the moment. And I believe they're asking for $5.5 million for this commission just for this coming year, which is also astounding. Myanmar, I believe, is less than $2 million. Sri Lanka was $1 million. It's an extraordinary amount of money. And then I'd say that the third notable feature is that it's aimed at collecting evidence to be used at the ICC, essentially. So, this isn't, again, it's not, and I would say also another troubling factor about that is in the past, and this commission has been no different to date, they basically pick commissioners that have a long history of anti-Israel bias. That's been true in every commission so far that's met. They are not experts in IHL, international humanitarian law. The commissioners don't really write the reports. They hire a staff of people that write the reports. Identities unknown usually. The process for picking these individuals is unknown. So it's a very secretive process. And NGOs play a huge factor because there's a lack of military and legal expertise on the staff usually. Basically, again, what they do is they will take NGO reporting and simply copy it verbatim. So we've seen that also in the Goldstone report, in the Chavis-Davis report from the 2014 war. So again, those factors are already in place, but yet they purport that they are going to now be collecting evidence to be used in potential criminal proceedings. So, that is also a very, very troubling factor. And then I would say probably the most troubling, well, I wouldn't say the most, but probably a very serious additional factor, and that ties into what Josh was saying, is that in addition to looking at the fighting, the commission is going to be looking at what they deem to be the root causes of systemic discrimination in the region. And the exact wording of the mandate tracks very closely to the wording of Human Rights Watch's Threshold Cross report. So it's clear that the aim of this commission is to issue a finding of apartheid. And I fully expect that will be the case. And then it is clear that they will then try to use that not only at the ICC, but at some other inquiries and activities that are going on.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So basically we have a kind of a system where it kind of feeds off itself. You have all these institutions and reports being created that result in resolutions leading to, I think we saw this in the Wall advisory opinion, didn't we? And the recent ICC, the prosecutor's request and the ICC's ruling. One question before we open it up to questions from the group. It seems to me that you have a whole bunch of states who have an agenda and they're using these institutions to push it, and they're supported by certain individuals who also share that agenda for whatever reason. But they don't necessarily form a majority of UN member states. There's a whole group of states that sit on the fence, and they don't stop this train moving forward. We had a conversation, Anne, recently about the Netherlands.
Yes.
And the Dutch government says, well, we stuck up our hand and we objected, we didn't like it, but it was voted in, so we have to accept this new commission of inquiry. That's pretty pathetic kind of attitude. Do you see any movement there? Do you see an increasing number of states, or potential for an increasing number of states, who could be more active in voicing their opposition or discontent, their objections to this process?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll say even before that, I should just mention that locally, there are 24 UN agencies operating. And they're operating under the auspices of what's known as the Humanitarian Country Team, run by UN OCHA, the Office of the Humanitarian Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And unfortunately, in that process, there is an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, between the UN agencies and the Palestinian Authority. And the number one strategic objective in their supposed humanitarian plan is to increasingly engage the human rights bodies at the UN to find violations against Israel. That's the number one strategic objective in this humanitarian plan. And the way that plan is executed is in conjunction with primarily the EU and European governments. So they have this cluster system, shelter, protection, education, food, and these groups meet. It's NGOs, and I will say several, at least a dozen of these NGOs are affiliated with the PFLP. 6 of them were designated by the Israeli government a month ago. One had been designated a year before that. Closely tied with these organizations, millions of dollars at issue. And a lot of this is for the feeding into these bigger projects like the COI. So just actually last week, we found a grant for several $100,000 going to 3 PFLP linked NGOs, one of which has been designated, to collect evidence to be used at the ICC and the COI against Israeli officials. This is coming out of the UN's Emergency Humanitarian Fund. So it's supposed to be aimed at rebuilding houses, providing food. And yet this money, and every European country contributes millions of dollars to this fund. It's now being used for lawfare, essentially, for political purposes, which is against the humanitarian principles and what I think the taxpayers who are providing this money, what they would think that money is being used for. So yes, I do think there is value in people going to their government officials and having them vote no on these resolutions. I think many times you see the European countries in particular abstaining from the resolutions, which personally I find very cowardly. The US, Canada, Australia, and the UK have been much better about voting no in recent years. Abstention, I don't understand it. And then I think once you have, and then what like our discussion on the Netherlands, once you've already opposed a process, why then are you supporting it and funding it? I think that's completely inconsistent. And we saw that also again in September, we had the 20th commemoration of the Durban conference. And notably, almost 40 countries boycotted the events. It was a one-day event in New York. So that was great. 40 countries said, we're not commemorating this horrible conference. But yet many of those countries then voted for the resolution that is basically continuing the Durban Declaration that was adopted at the conference. And so again, that's quite inconsistent. So I think that's the main message I would say to government officials and anyone who has influence over that is that they need to call for consistency, not only in the voting, but also in what they support, how they engage, and also in the money that they provide.
Thanks, Anne. That's great. I'm going to hand back to Aryeh.